The Emperor has been expecting you.
Greetings, Star Travelers. This is Manu Nushanka. English subtitles are included, as always. Have you ever thought of the fact what ship in a Star Wars universe is the biggest of all? The Executor-class flagship of Darth Vader? The Eclipse-class flagship of Emperor himself? Or maybe Snoke's flagship, the pride of the new canon that already generated a lot of noise around YouTube? Well, today we're going to discuss exactly that. So I guess many of you already heard of Yuuzhan Vong's. If you did, you will definitely like this video. And if you only found out about the fascinating universe of Star Wars a short time ago, then you will be doubly happy to know how these guys are linked to the topic of our today's video. At this moment, many have already heard about this terrifying race of space conquerors that terrorized entire galaxies and who were one of the most dangerous enemies for both the Galactic Empire and for the New Republic in a whole galaxy far, far away. And what were these guys also famous for, except for their militarism, masochism, and urge to biologically change themselves, and their hatred towards all mechanical things, including droids? Yep, they were also famous for their huge, gigantic, ginormous spaceships that they utilized to traverse around the galaxy and beyond. The Yuuzhan Vong fleet was very diverse, thanks to the fact that it was, in fact, nothing more than a bunch of some kind of gigantic, spacefaring coral reefs that served as homes for millions of extremely dangerous inhabitants. Taking into consideration their way of interacting with the surrounding world, we can easily compare Yuuzhan Vong's to Tyranids from Warhammer 40,000, or for example with Zergs from StarCraft. Yet we must also note that their habits were similar to those of Dark Eldars. After conquering a world, Yuuzhan Vong's frequently initiated a process of so-called Vong forming. That allowed them to populate the entire planet first with spores, and then with adult organisms of many different kinds and species that were symbiotic with the main Yuuzhan Vong species. The process of Vong forming, as you might have guessed, was not peaceful, and it usually destroyed the vast majority of ecosystems that were once present on a conquered planet. During the war with Yuuzhan Vong's, more than 300 trillion individuals died in the Star Wars galaxy. Most of them were either citizens of the New Republic or the Imperial Remnants, as well as some other affected space governments, including the Cheese Ascendancy. If I'm not mistaken, Killiks were also affected by this bloody conflict, even though they were once a threat that could destroy the population of entire planets by devouring all of the native species. Yuuzhan Vong's created their terrifying fleets right on the surface of the planets that were conquered by them, literally sucking out of the ground and even out of other starships different kinds of materials that could later be processed and turned into a so-called Yorick coral. Yet the bones of the ships and other structures created of it were much stronger than the skull of one famous Shakespearean character. This fascinating material, thanks to the advanced technologies used by Yuuzhan Vong shapers, was so tough and so durable that it could protect the items even from turbolaser fire, even without using deflector shields. Should I remind you that a turbolaser blast could devastate entire cities? By the way, I have a video devoted to the topic of how only one Star Destroyer can annihilate populations of entire planets. I strongly recommend you to check it out, but of course, the decision is always yours. Many things could be manufactured from the noted Yorick coral. from bodies of light starfighters and cases of reactive shells to carcasses and armor of so-called Chorus Strona, also known as world ships in Galactic Basic Standard Language. These huge coral vessels, real space cities, were created in different sizes. There was also a possibility of repairing and upgrading the starships right in the outer space by literally growing the additional layers of coral substance. Some of Chorus Strona were as big as the first Death Star and could carry a huge amount of weaponry on board. Beginning with tiny Yaret cores that could discharge overheated shells that looked ugly and awkward at the first glance, yet at the same time being incredibly powerful, fast, and deadly projectiles. These projectiles could be created right in action, out of asteroids or out of remains of enemy starships. Of course, it would be very logical to presume that projectiles like this weren't as powerful as turbolaser blasts that were used by both the Galactic Empire and the New Republic, but the fact that both the shells and new batteries could be created literally out of space garbage turned Yuuzhan Vongs into one of the deadliest enemies the Galactic Society ever encountered. As a rule, not so many Yuuzhan Vongs populated the huge spacefaring coral cities, and we know that every Chorus Strona carried only a limited amount of warriors on board. Yet at the same time, the ship also served as the home for many thousands, or perhaps even millions of units of Yuuzhan Vong's propriety, slaves and tamed animals that were crucial for the survivability of the Yuuzhan Vong society. Except for Gauss-like Yaret cores, as well as for many plasma weaponry, including the weaponry installed on so-called Yorick Ets, swarms of which surrounded the world ships, there were also other remarkable kinds of deadly things, including Coral Skull, also known as Dread Weapons. Gigantic worm-like creatures that were engineered by Yuuzhan Vong scientists were used as projectiles for this kind of weaponry, and during the battle, they were usually sent towards enemy starships, space stations, and fortified planetary citadels, with the aim to stick to the target and bore holes in it, to literally suck out everything into their deadly insides, drinking all of the substances and objects present on the ships and inside stations and fortresses. Air, fuel, weapons, and of course, its unhappy inhabitants. Chorus Stronas could indeed be called the pearl of the Yuuzhan Vong fleet, the very instrument with which this race of aggressive devourers from outer space could conquer and destroy a great number of planets that were unlucky enough to be on their path. We should also never forget about the fact that choruses, despite their huge sizes, were relatively fast ships. Of course, in the atmosphere, thanks to the friction force, the speed of these giants fell dramatically and could rarely exceed the mark of 400 kilometers per hour. And it is quite understandable. Those weren't some starfighters. Those were huge rocks, gigantic cities flying in the skies. Nonetheless, in a vacuum of space, Chorus Stronas felt just like a fish would feel in water, exceeding the acceleration of 1,100 Gs, the acceleration that is unachievable by our engines, developed by human beings, even in the wet dreams of some crazy geniuses. Of course, any Imperial Star Destroyer was faster than any given Yuuzhan Vong worldcraft. It was almost twice as fast in the vacuum of space. Such speeds were not surprising for the inhabitants of the Star Wars universe, but the very fact that such a huge coral object a real spacefaring city could move so fast really terrified those who was unlucky enough to meet them in the same solar system. And thus, to sum up, we can say that Korostrona were one of the biggest military objects ever built that had no problem moving around the vacuum of space, and whose impressive weaponry was the very factor that makes us consider Yuuzhan Vong's to be one of the most powerful military organizations in the galaxy far, far away. It could one-handedly confront and withstand the might of the New Republic, and whose military capabilities were only surpassed by the Galactic Empire during its peak years. However, that is how our video is going to end. If you would like to know new facts about the universe of Star Wars and the science fiction in general, then don't forget to leave a like. It is really important, as well as your subscription. That is why I want to say a big thank you to all of those who regularly leaves their likes and who is already subscribed. Have a nice day, and I will always be grateful to see you on my streams. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you, always.